They labelled him without mercy. They called him the banker of terror. Youssef Nader was placed on a terror list after 9/11 for allegedly supporting Osama bin Laden. The Swiss authorities played a disgraceful role in this as compliant assistants to the USA without having any evidence at all. Next Wednesday, the European Court of Human Rights will pass judgment on Nader's case in Strasbourg. This could be a highly embarrassing situation for Switzerland and bring justice at last for the businessman. Pascal Schumacher and Bruno Amrein. Fantastic views of Lake Lugano. It is from here that Egyptian-Italian businessman Youssef Nader had to watch helplessly as he lost everything he had built up over the decades. Youssef Nader spent 8 years confined to the small Italian enclave of Campione, surrounded by areas of Switzerland which he was not permitted to enter.
Doctor no, court no, lawyer no, money no, and that means they kill you and they say you are a terrorist. Who is the terrorist, you or me?
Youssef Nader says Switzerland and the USA have imposed a kind of death sentence on him, without a fair process and without the option of recourse. This is also the view held by Dick Marty, a former member of the Council of States and one of the leading human rights experts in Europe. The Nader case represents something of a blot on the landscape for Swiss law.
Der Fall Nader
The Nader case has broken something at a fundamental level. The trust that certain things don't happen in our country. Before, we celebrated our constitutional state, our freedom and the protection of our citizens. But none of these principles were respected in this case. 11 years ago, there was a terrorist attack on the USA. It was on this day that the nightmare began for Youssef Nader. The USA had been humiliated as a superpower and wanted payback. The USA declared war on the henchmen of terror across the world.
Good morning. We will starve the terrorists of funding, turn them against each other, rout them out of their safe hiding places, and bring them to justice.
4 days later, the UN Security Council passed a resolution against terror. Following pressure from the USA, the Security Council also extended its blacklist of terror suspects. Hundreds of alleged supporters of terrorism were added to the list. Their assets were frozen across the world, and substantial restrictions were imposed on their freedom to travel. Businessman Youssef Nader was living in a villa in Campione at this time and found himself on the blacklist at the request of the Americans. They based their suspicion on a somewhat questionable newspaper article. From that point on, Nader was deemed to be a banker for terror and was suspected of financing Al-Qaeda.
Have you ever financed Islamistic terrorists?
There is no way that I engage with something against my belief. The Americans said that in September and October 2001, I gave cash to bin Laden. Tell me how they are looking for him everywhere in the world. And I'm sitting here and I give him money. And they saw me giving him the money. Can you imagine that?
The Americans felt that Nader had the typical profile of a suspect who financed terrorism. He was a Muslim and a banker with links to the Arab world, as well as being a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. Nader started out his career as an agricultural engineer in Egypt. He soon went on to become a successful food trader before leaving his homeland to develop an international cement enterprise. Finally, he set up a financial business, the Al-Taqwa Bank. It was at this point that he came under scrutiny from the USA.
Unfortunately, whatever you do to prove your innocence, you are not innocent. Because George Bush said that you are not innocent. Everyone have to obey him.
And Switzerland complied. Justice Minister Ruth Metzler wanted to lead the fight against terror shoulder to shoulder with the USA. Bern placed Nader on its own list of suspects and instigated proceedings against him. 2 months after 9/11, a double strike on Youssef Nada. The Italian Carabinieri searched his villa in Campione. And on the other side of the lake, the Swiss office of the Attorney General got involved, confiscating boxes of documents from Youssef Nada's Al Taqwa Bank in Lugano. The Swiss investigation was led by Deputy Attorney General Claude Nicati in close collaboration with the USA. But there was very little evidence against Nada, as revealed for the first time by documents presented exclusively by the Rundschau. 2 months after the raid in Lugano, Nicati wrote to Washington to say he was disappointed with the information provided by the Americans. "Everything I have received from you is so superficial that I cannot use it to continue my investigations," Nicati wrote. Nicati never received anything tangible from Washington in relation to Nada, but the Americans got everything they wanted from Switzerland. 7 FBI agents traveled to Bern in April 2002. They spent days analyzing the documents which the Office of the Attorney General had confiscated from the Al Taqwa Bank. In this letter, they expressed their gratitude for being granted full access to the documents. Thousands of account numbers, names and addresses were taken to Washington without request for judicial assistance. This is illegal. We show these documents to Dick Marty. He is astonished. In his eyes, Deputy Attorney General Nicati has clearly breached the rules on mutual legal assistance. I collaborated with the Americans in my role as public prosecutor, and I never did anything like that. The Americans have introduced a fast-track process in the form of this blacklist so that they can claim Nada was involved in terrorist activity. Why didn't the Americans just request the extradition of Nada, for example? That would have been easy enough, even if he was in Italy. Around a fifth of the employees at the Office of the Attorney General worked on the case at one time or another, and despite investing millions, they did not find a shred of evidence. In summer 2003, investigators recommended that the Attorney General close the case due to, quote, a lack of evidence of any terror financing. Several such reports were ignored by Claude Nicati. From the very outset, they were saying, look, we have no evidence. But the Attorney General in charge, I believe, was clearly committed to supporting the Americans. And as long as the case is pending in Switzerland, there was a good reason to maintain the blacklist. Today, Claude Nicati is a member of the State Governing Council in the canton of Neuenburg. He declined an interview with the Rundschau despite numerous requests. So the questions remain as to whether or not he continued with the investigation for political reasons. Nicati's successors at the Office of the Attorney General also declined to comment. The process has had grave consequences for Youssef Nada. He's incapable of action in Campione. His business has gone bankrupt.
I lived here with the Swiss people 42 years. I had all the possibility to live anywhere in the world. Why I chose it? Because I admire the system in Switzerland, admire the Swiss people, how they behave and how they treat the others. The main place who attacked me, it was the Swiss prosecutor who ruined my reputation everywhere in the world.
Youssef Nada finally received some good news in 2005 when the Federal Criminal Court forced Nicati to stop proceedings. But Nada still remained on the UN terror list for another 4 years. The Federal Council continued to impose all of the sanctions against Nada throughout this time, despite the lack of any evidence against him. If we imagine that these sanctions had been requested by Russia or China instead of America, and these countries are also members of the Security Council, I bet you anything Switzerland would not have imposed the sanctions. The European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg has been looking into the case for the last year and a half. Nada decided to sue Switzerland for breaching his human rights. He wants his reputation back. The verdict is expected next Wednesday.